Westbeth used to be my home, so I'm visiting a place that I used to live. I lived here from 95 to 2006, but I spent a good deal of time here in the 70s and early 80s because my best friend, who later became my landlord, was a painter named Gay Edward Milius III, who lived on the 13th floor in apartment 1302. In 95, he moved in with his second wife to the eastern shore of Virginia, but he wanted to keep the apartment, so he sublet it to me. And I already knew the building. It was a place I'd known since I was in my 20s. And I became officially his roommate, unofficially his tenant. Our arrangement was that he would come up once or twice a month to work the flea markets because he made his living as a picker. So he'd work the 26th Street flea, and he would come up and stay in the apartment, which continued our friendship. He committed a suicide in the apartment in 2006. January, his body was found, I believe, on the 19th, but he may have taken his life a day or two earlier. At the end of his life, his second marriage had broken up under really hideous circumstances. He was suffering both from mental illness, probably from substance abuse disorder. And he is a cautionary example of, I don't want to say artistic failure, but he was an artist who could not express the vastness of his feeling and experience in any one medium. And he hadn't found the medium that worked for him. So at the end of his life, he was broke. He had spent time in jail because he had violated a protection order, inadvertently or by accident. He had been abused while in county jail in, I think, Accomack County. He had gone to live with his half-sister who was dying of melanoma, and then finally ended up back in the apartment. And I was paying the rent. He had no way of making a living. And through a very complicated set of circumstances, he had sublet the apartment to a second tenant who he believed was going to take it from him. And I think that combination of circumstances was what drove him to take his life. He worked up a rather ingenious suicide machine. He ran a length of hose or tube from a propane grill on the roof, which was the grill that I had used to barbecue with, put a shopping bag over his head, took some pills probably, but inhaled the gas and passed out and then died. By the time he was found, he was in a state of decomposition. I could see it in the photographs that I identified. And for years and years afterwards, I was trying to write his story. Partly because I felt on one level that his story could have been my story. I had also suffered a similar artistic failure. I maybe accepted the fact that I would have to earn a living one way or another, and he had never been able to do that. Or else I had stopped drinking and drugging 20-odd years before that. I think that helped. But I felt like it could have been my story. I could have ended up like him. He was my best friend for 30 years. And there was something that I wasn't getting as I kept trying to write the story, and I realized what I was not writing about was the fact that he lived in a community of artists, of almost 400 of them. Westbeth has 384 apartments. So I set out to find out what was going on in this community and to see the experience of what it was like to be an artist in New York, maybe one who never became famous, who always had to work a B job, that was the situation of most of the artists. And when I say artists, I also mean writers and dancers and actors and musicians and composers. That was our common situation. There are relatively few artists survive just making their art. And those are considered the success. That is the rough measure of success, although I have a different, more nuanced measure. So I began writing a history of the building, mostly in the words of the people that I interviewed, because I'm always interested in the way people talk about themselves. And I placed his story in conversation with the stories of other artists, some of them quite successful, like Deanna Arbus, who also ended up taking her life. She was one of the first suicides in the building. And it's a building that, as you probably know, has a reputation for suicide. Kids who've grown up here refer to it as Deathbeth, or some of the kids do. And some of them were people, they were like ordinary civilians. They were people who had comfortable, sane, laboriously cobbled out middle-class lives, who managed to support themselves and sometimes their entire families while making art and while fulfilling their ideals in whatever medium they worked in. And those people, to me, were and are heroes. They're doing the most difficult thing in the world, which is to practice a genre or a form that is not widely valued, that requires great resources of time and imagination, and sometimes of money, if you're a visual artist or a filmmaker, for example, or a musician. Writers have it easy, and they devote their lives to this. There are people who have lived here now well over 50 years, since the building opened in 1970. So I placed Gay's story in conversation with those of about 6 or 7 of his neighbors. Very few of whom knew him. He kept to himself. He was he was deeply social, but he was not involved in the life of the building. And when I sublet from him, he was very insistent on the idea that I should not let on that I lived in that apartment. He would say, everybody here hates us. They hate us. They think we're rich. So don't talk to them. So I didn't talk to people. I didn't go to people's shows. I didn't talk to people in the elevator. But I was acutely aware of this life that was going on around me. I was aware that there were shows. I sometimes went in as they were being set up. There were receptions. There were theater openings. There was all sorts of stuff going on, and it was going on around me, and it was exactly the kind of thing, if I had not felt paranoid, that I would have been involved in. So I had to almost reconstruct a life that I didn't have afterwards. I began writing this book after many attempts to write Gay's story in 2019, so that's 13 years after his death. I first came to the building, I think in 1976, right after Gay and his first wife, Molly, had moved into their apartment on the 13th floor. They had a commercial lease because he had originally been admitted in 1970 as a painter, but when he and Molly got together, they needed a bigger space. She was a filmmaker, but she worked in finance. So they were given one of the spaces on the 13th floor that he repurposed the way Westbeth itself had been repurposed. It had about 900 square feet of floor space, but the ceilings were 18 feet. So he built a series of platforms. So it was a triplex, quite spectacular. I remember when I first saw it in the 70s, I was just in awe. Nobody I knew in New York had an apartment like that. And I used to love, he and Molly, his first wife, used to travel a lot, so I would often take care of their dogs, Cracker and Crumbs. In his life, he always had dogs. They were always named after baked goods, except for his last dog, who was named Raz. It was a big, rather beautiful, aloof husky dog that he found in somebody's backyard on the eastern shore of Virginia. And maybe the fact that he broke the pattern, that this was not a dog named after a baked good, was an omen of one kind or another. In writing the Twilight of Bohemia, I was writing a haunted book in a way, but I wanted to contrast a life that was slowly spiraling downward with the active, vigorous, enchanted lives of working artists. People like Jack Dowling, people like Christina Maley, who has had an amazing career, who came here in 1970 as a playwright, writing self-consciously feminist theater. In fact, one of her first shows was called Rape In, who then reinvented herself. She became a carpenter. She renovated or built platforms and loft beds in many of the apartments in the building. She then became a landscape architect. She was going to go to architecture school, but she was thrown off by calculus, and she found out that if she became a landscape architect, she didn't need the math requirement. So she worked for the Parks Department for 25 or 30 years, did beautiful work there, and then began doing prints that are just spectacular. They're really vivid. They use motifs and designs from, she is of West Indian and Dayak ancestry. So there are like indigenous patterns that come into the work, and also there's a lot of multiplicity or multiple images. In the book, I say that some of the work looked, I don't know if they were influenced by, it was a question I should have asked her at the time, by the posters for bands that used to be all over the Lower East Side and the West Village, for that matter, just sort of, pasted on top of each other until they were almost like a carapace on top of light posts, lamp posts, and mailboxes. So the work was quite brilliant, and she has been discovered lately. I know she had a show, I believe at the Brooklyn Museum, but we don't have to get into that. Another artist who I wrote about was Lorraine O'Grady, who is really a visionary artist, a Black performance artist and collagist and conceptual artist who worked in multiple media. She had a fascinating career. She did not start making art until relatively late. She wrote an essay called, I think it's called Olympia's Maid, in search of Black female subjectivity. That was one of the first written works to consider the status of Black women, both as artists and as objects of art, or subjects of art. And her work is still being rediscovered and reevaluated. She was one of the first people I contacted, and we were going to do interviews, and then she had this huge retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum in 21. And she just broke, and she was just inundated with requests for interviews. She was digitizing her archive, and she just was unavailable. And in the last months before, when I was finishing the manuscript, I wrote her because I'd written about her based on, stuff that I'd found in journals and videos that I'd seen and looking at her work. And I just wanted to be sure that I wasn't getting her grotesquely wrong. And she wrote me back. I sent her the pages I'd written about her, and she said, this is just beautiful. This really, I just wish that I had the time to tell you what it was like to live here. And she died a couple months after that, at the age of 90. So that's my great regret associated with this book. I spoke with Bob Gruen, who told the famous John Lennon story, which you don't need to hear a second time. The person that I consider the most successful portrait, apart from Gaze, is the portrait of Barton Benish, who I never met. He died in 2012, so 7 years before I began this project. I was aware of him when I lived in the building. I didn't really know what he did. His apartment is recreated in the Museum of North Dakota. The North Dakota Museum of Art in Grand Forks, North Dakota, on the campus of the University of North Dakota. And it is there because in the early 90s, probably 91, He did a show of his using vessels of his HIV-positive blood. It was called Lethal Weapons. He had a water gun filled with blood. He had like those novelty squirt flowers. He had a vial of holy water filled with his blood. And no gallery would show it. And finally, the Museum of North Dakota showed it, to their great credit. He already had a connection with them. He had done a display or a piece for them as part of a benefit. And his work is really interesting. It's like a droller Joseph Cornell. He called the pieces reliquaries. They're boxes often the size of a wall, divided into little chambers. They usually have a theme. He, for example, has one that uses artifacts taken from other artists, usually more famous ones. So there's a scrap of Rothko's shirt. There's a brush that belonged to Rauschenberg. And they're all beautifully laid out. He had one piece on feet, which included a mummified human toe that somebody had found under the Williamsburg Bridge. He became, people sort of would find out about him, particularly when he began doing work that was about AIDS, and started donating stuff to him. He would say, everybody's got something that they don't know what to do with. And he became the repository for that stuff. The most beautiful of his pieces began, he had been sent the ashes of a young woman named Brenda, who had a rough childhood. She'd been sexually and physically abused, I think, by her either biological or adoptive parents, had lived on the street, and contracted the virus and died, I think, at the age of 40. And somebody bequeathed the ashes to Barton. And Barton, he was watching, I think, this was around the time when AIDS ribbons began to appear. And at first they were just like little cardboard ribbons. But then it sort of acquired a kind of momentum of its own, and people began buying very expensive pins. And I forget what year it would have been, but it was at an Oscars telecast, and he saw that one of the presenters was wearing this jeweled AIDS pin. And he was just furious, like, why didn't this guy just donate $50,000 to AMFAR or to Visual AIDS, which was the artist's AIDS collective that he worked on? And so he made a series of cardboard ribbons that he then dipped in Brenda's ashes and mounted them in a wall. They look almost like an aerial shot of a military graveyard. It's something about the repetition and the regular display of these objects. And it was first displayed at the North Dakota Museum of Art. When people walk into that room, they almost always fall silent. To my mind, it is the greatest and most breathtaking piece on the AIDS pandemic. And there's been a lot of work done about AIDS. He was gone by the time I began the project, but I was able to speak with everybody who had known him. His little brother, Warren, his best friends in the building, his neighbor, Joan Hall, his curator in North Dakota. And it really, in some ways, I feel I knew him better than I knew people who I spoke with like every week for months. To me, this building, it is a model of what I hope the kind of housing that may be revived under a new mayor like Mamdani, and who understands the vital and absolutely vital role the arts and artists have in the life of the city, and also in its economic life. But it's also I've been doing a series of symposiums about the idea of downtown. And part of downtown is the fact that there's a community of people who live near each other, who see each other's works, who go to each other's galleries or into each other's studios, who read each other's manuscripts, who would go hear each other's bands or shows. And that's vanishing because the number of venues like that is diminishing, and the number of artists who can afford to live in the city gets smaller all the time because of the catastrophic rise in rents. So to me, Westbeth is a model. I'm always thrilled to hear about new tenants moving in. Part of its poignance for me is that many of the original tenants have either passed or are quite old now. I come from the generation after that. But, to me, they are elders who I bow down before, just as I bow down before the memory of my friend.